The Interstellar Academy of Advanced Sciences prided itself on being the pinnacle of galactic civilization, a gleaming testament to what could be achieved when truly enlightened species put their magnificent minds together. Of course, the definition of enlightened was rather selective, much like an exclusive club that only admitted members who already owned 3 vacation planets and could pronounce quantum entanglement in at least 7 different languages while sipping imported Altarian wine. The Academy's crystal spires reached toward the artificial sky of Station Nexus Prime, each level more rarefied than the last, where the most delicate and sophisticated beings in the galaxy gathered to contemplate the universe's mysteries. These weren't your garden variety sentients who might accidentally stub a toe on a coffee table. No, these were creatures so evolved, so perfectly adapted to their peaceful worlds that they required environmental suits just to visit planets with gravity exceeding 0.7 standard units. The student body was a carefully curated collection of the galaxy's finest. Ethereal Veil Nari, who communicated through color-shifting crystalline formations, Gossamer Pithkari, whose bones were made of something resembling delicate porcelain, and various other species whose greatest evolutionary achievement was avoiding anything that might remotely resemble actual physical exertion. They studied theoretical combat, philosophical warfare, and the art of conflict resolution through interpretive dance. Into this bastion of refined learning had somehow wandered Zara Blackthorne, a human exchange student from that notorious ball of violence known as Earth. She stuck out like a particularly robust thumb among the Academy's collection of elegant, fragile scholars. While her classmates required mobility assistance to navigate the Academy's perfectly flat corridors, Zara had the audacity to walk around without any support systems whatsoever, breathing the station's atmosphere like some kind of primitive savage. The irony wasn't lost on anyone with functioning brain cells, though. Those seemed to be in short supply among the Academy's more pretentious residents. Here was a species that had crawled out of what the galactic community politely termed a death world, yet she was the only student who didn't need a medical team on standby during lunch breaks. Vexthari Quindal was perhaps the Academy's most shining example of advanced evolution, assuming one measured advancement by the total number of environmental controls needed to keep oneself alive in any given situation. A Zentaurian of impeccable pedigree, he possessed skin that would make butterfly wings seem robust, internal organs that functioned about as well as a chocolate teapot under stress, and an ego that could be seen from 3 star systems away. Zentaurians had achieved perfection, according to Vexthari, through the elegant process of removing all possible sources of discomfort from their existence. Their homeworld maintained a constant temperature of exactly 23.7 degrees Celsius, with humidity levels that never deviated by more than 0.02%. The weather was a concept their ancestors had abolished roughly 5,000 years ago, along with physical labor, loud noises, and anything that might cause what lesser species called character building. The result was a being of such refined sensibilities that he could detect atmospheric pressure changes by the nanosecond, and whose idea of extreme sports involved reading philosophy texts without proper lumbar support. Vexthari had never experienced pain greater than a mild headache, never faced genuine fear, and certainly never been in a situation where his survival depended on anything more challenging than remembering to activate his personal climate control system, which made his particular fascination with mocking the Deathworld girl all the more entertaining. From a cosmic irony standpoint, the Advanced Combat Theory classroom was a marvel of modern educational technology, designed to let students examine warfare from the safe, sterile distance that proper civilization demanded. Professor Keth Mori, a silicate whose idea of combat experience came from watching historical documentaries, presided over lessons that treated military strategy like abstract art, beautiful to contemplate but certainly nothing one would ever dirty one's hands with personally. The class was currently engaged in what the Academy generously called practical application, though it bore about as much resemblance to actual combat as a recipe did to a 5-course meal. Students were expected to demonstrate their understanding of advanced tactical principles using the Academy's state-of-the-art holographic simulation systems, which were designed to be so perfectly safe that even the most delicate constitution couldn't possibly come to harm. Zara sat in the back row, as had become her habit, watching her classmates navigate combat scenarios with all the urgency of someone arranging flowers for a particularly sedate tea party. The simulations featured weapons that looked impressive but couldn't actually hurt anyone, opponents programmed to be challenging but not distressingly so, and scenarios carefully crafted to test intellectual understanding, rather than anything as crude as actual survival instincts. "Now then," Professor Kethmolry announced, his crystalline voice carrying the sort of authority that came from having read extensively about topics he'd never actually experienced, "today we shall examine the primitive combat methodologies employed by less advanced civilizations, a fascinating study in how raw brutality can sometimes, through sheer luck, achieve results that more enlightened approaches handle with infinitely more sophistication." He gestured toward a holographic display showing various primitive species engaged in what the Academy termed crude physical alterations. The images were sanitized, of course, cleaned up for consumption by sensibilities too refined for actual reality. "As you can see," the professor continued, "these unfortunate beings, lacking the intellectual capacity for proper tactical analysis, resort to direct physical confrontation. Quite tragic, really. One can only imagine how much more they might achieve if they possessed the mental faculties for truly advanced strategic thinking." A ripple of refined laughter swept through the classroom, the sort of polite chuckling that indicated everyone understood they were observing their intellectual inferiors. Vexthari's contribution to this symphony of superiority was particularly melodious, his voice carrying the confident certainty of someone who'd never been wrong about anything, mostly because he'd never been tested on anything that actually mattered. "Professor," Vexthari said, raising one delicate appendage with practiced elegance, "I believe we have a perfect example of such primitive thinking right here in our classroom." His gaze settled on Zara, with the sort of smile that suggested he was about to demonstrate his intellectual superiority for the education and entertainment of his peers. The classroom fell silent with anticipation, the sort of eager quiet that preceded a particularly good bit of academic bloodsport. Zara looked up from her notes, her expression carrying the sort of mild interest one might show when noticing an unusual insect. "Miss Blackthorne," Vexthari continued, warming to his theme, "perhaps you could enlighten us about the strategic principles employed by your species. I'm certain we'd all benefit from understanding how beings from Deathworlds approach the sophisticated art of combat." The way he pronounced Deathworld made it sound like a particularly distasteful medical condition, something that might be discussed in hushed tones by concerned physicians. The rest of the class leaned forward slightly, not enough to appear unseemly, interested, but sufficiently to catch every word of what promised to be a delightfully educational humiliation. Zara set down her stylus with the sort of deliberate care that suggested she was taking the question seriously, which was probably the first warning sign that someone with functioning survival instincts might have noticed. "Strategic principles?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough genuine curiosity to sound like she was actually considering the question, rather than wondering whether her interrogator had functioning brain cells. "Indeed," Vexthari said, his confidence growing as he interpreted her measured response as evidence of intellectual inadequacy. "Surely even primitive cultures must have some sort of systematic approach to conflict resolution, though I imagine it's rather more straightforward than the sophisticated methodologies we study here." Professor Kethmolry nodded approvingly, clearly pleased to see one of his star students providing such an excellent demonstration of advanced analytical thinking. The fact that this analysis was being conducted by someone whose greatest physical challenge was remembering to activate his anti-gravity chair seemed to escape everyone's attention. "Well," Zara said, settling back in her chair with a sort of relaxed posture that suggested she was perfectly comfortable being the center of attention, "human strategic thinking does tend to be fairly straightforward. We have this saying, if you find yourself in a fair fight, someone made a mistake." The classroom erupted in polite laughter, the sort of refined amusement that indicated everyone understood they were witnessing primitive wisdom being displayed for their educational benefit. Vexthari's smile widened, clearly delighted to have prompted such a perfect example of crude thinking. "How wonderfully direct," he said, his tone dripping with the sort of condescension that came naturally to beings who'd never had to consider the possibility that their intellectual superiority might be tested by anything more demanding than a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. Though I suspect such an approach would prove rather inadequate when faced with truly advanced strategic thinking. "Probably," Zara agreed, with the sort of easy acceptance that suggested she'd given the matter considerable thought. "Our approach does have certain limitations." This admission of intellectual inferiority was clearly what the audience had been waiting for. Vexthari practically glowed with satisfaction, having successfully demonstrated the obvious superiority of advanced civilization over primitive barbarism. The fact that he'd accomplished this stunning feat without actually demonstrating anything more challenging than his ability to state the obvious seemed to escape everyone's notice. "Perhaps," Professor Kethmori interjected, sensing an opportunity for educational advancement, "we might arrange a practical demonstration, a comparison of advanced strategic thinking versus primitive approaches, for academic purposes, of course." The suggestion sent a wave of excitement through the classroom, the sort of barely contained enthusiasm that suggested everyone was looking forward to witnessing a particularly educational massacre. Vexthari's acceptance was immediate and gracious, delivered with the sort of confident smile that indicated he was looking forward to providing his classmates with a demonstration of true intellectual superiority. Zara's acceptance was quieter, accompanied by the sort of thoughtful nod that suggested she was considering the educational value of the exercise, which should have been the second warning sign if anyone had been paying attention to anything other than their own anticipated entertainment. The Academy's combat simulation arena was a masterpiece of advanced technology, designed to provide perfectly safe approximations of dangerous situations. The environment could be adjusted to simulate everything from asteroid mining operations to diplomatic negotiations, though always with the sort of safety features that ensured no participant could possibly experience anything more distressing than mild intellectual embarrassment. The arena's observation deck filled with students and faculty, all eager to witness what promised to be a fascinating comparison of civilized methodology versus primitive instinct. The betting pools, which the Academy politely ignored as informal mathematical probability exercises, heavily favored Vexthari, though the odds were so extreme that few people bothered to calculate them precisely. The combatants were provided with the Academy's standard selection of simulation weapons and defensive systems, all carefully calibrated to provide realistic tactical feedback without any possibility of actual harm. The weapons looked impressive enough to satisfy aesthetic requirements, while being about as dangerous as particularly stern-looked. Vexthari selected his equipment with the sort of careful precision that suggested he'd given considerable thought to the strategic implications of each choice. His defensive systems were state-of-the-art, his weapons were perfectly balanced for maximum theoretical effectiveness, and his tactical analysis system could process battlefield data faster than most species could blink. Zara's equipment selection was considerably more modest, consisting of basic defensive gear and what appeared to be the simulation equivalent of a simple kinetic weapon. Her choices prompted knowing looks among the observers, who interpreted her limited selection as evidence of either primitive thinking or crushing poverty, though the distinction hardly mattered for present purposes. The simulation began with both combatants positioned at opposite ends of the arena, which had been configured to represent a generic battlefield environment with sufficient cover and tactical options to allow for interesting strategic development. The scenario was designed to test adaptability, strategic thinking, and the ability to utilize available resources effectively. Vexthari's opening moves were textbook perfect, demonstrating the sort of tactical sophistication that the Academy's curriculum was designed to instill. He established defensive positions, analyzed environmental factors, and began implementing a carefully planned strategy that would have earned full marks on any theoretical examination. Zara, meanwhile, appeared to be doing very little beyond basic survival maneuvers, moving from cover to cover with the sort of straightforward efficiency that suggested she was either panicking or operating on pure instinct. Her actions lacked the elegant complexity that characterized proper strategic thinking, instead displaying the sort of direct approach that primitive minds defaulted to when faced with situations beyond their intellectual capacity. The early exchanges seemed to confirm everyone's expectations. Vexthari's advanced weaponry and superior tactics were clearly dominant, forcing his opponent into increasingly desperate defensive positions. His precise, calculated attacks demonstrated the sort of intellectual superiority that separated truly advanced civilizations from their primitive cousins. The observers noted with satisfaction that the Deathworld girl was being systematically outmaneuvered by someone who understood the true art of combat. This was exactly the sort of educational demonstration that made the Academy's reputation for producing the galaxy's finest strategic minds well-deserved. What took somewhat longer to become apparent was that Zara wasn't actually retreating in panic. She was studying. Every attack Vexthari launched was observed, analyzed, and filed away for future reference. Every tactical maneuver was noted and catalogued, Every piece of equipment was examined for potential weaknesses or exploitable characteristics. While he was demonstrating his superiority, she was building a comprehensive database of his capabilities, limitations, and behavioral patterns. The realization came gradually, like a sunrise that nobody particularly wanted to acknowledge. Vexthari's attacks were becoming less effective, not because his strategic thinking was failing, but because his opponent was adapting to them. His carefully planned tactical approaches were being countered by someone who was learning from each exchange and adjusting accordingly. This was the point where the educational value of the exercise began to shift in directions that the Academy's curriculum hadn't anticipated. Strategic thinking, it turned out, was a considerably more complex subject than anyone had realized, particularly when practiced by someone whose species had developed their analytical skills in environments where mistakes had consequences more severe than academic embarrassment. Zara's counterattacks, when they finally came, displayed the sort of creative thinking that civilized minds found deeply disturbing. She used the environment in ways that the simulation designers hadn't intended, exploited weaknesses in Vexthari's equipment that no theoretical analysis had identified, and demonstrated tactical approaches that weren't covered in any textbook because they required the sort of desperate creativity that only emerged under genuine pressure. The turning point came when Vexthari realized that his intellectual superiority was being systematically dismantled by someone who had learned everything he could teach and was now applying those lessons in ways that his advanced strategic training hadn't prepared him for. The panic that followed was educational in its own right, providing a fascinating demonstration of how quickly sophisticated tactical thinking could collapse when faced with genuinely unexpected challenges. The simulation safety systems ensured that no permanent harm could come to either participant, but they weren't designed to prevent the sort of psychological damage that came from having one's fundamental assumptions about the universe proven catastrophically incorrect. Vexthari's final defensive position collapsed under an assault that combined everything he'd taught his opponent with applications that no civilized mind would have considered. The aftermath was instructive, in the sort of way that most people preferred to avoid. Vexthari's injuries were primarily psychological, though the simulation's medical systems did require some time to address the various stress conditions that had manifested during his educational experience. The feeding tube that became necessary was a medical precaution, rather than a direct result of physical trauma, but it did provide a rather literal fulfillment of the situation's inevitable conclusion. The Academy's faculty spent considerable time discussing the implications of what they'd witnessed, though their conversations tended to focus on administrative concerns rather than the more fundamental questions about the nature of strategic thinking and the definition of advanced civilization. The student body, meanwhile, developed a notably different attitude toward their Deathworld classmate, though whether this represented increased respect or simple fear was a matter of considerable debate. Zara's explanation, when requested, was characteristically straightforward. Humans, she noted, had developed their strategic thinking in environments where theoretical understanding needed to be combined with practical application under genuine pressure. Academic excellence was all well and good, but survival required the sort of adaptive thinking that could only be developed through experience, with actual consequences. The broader implications of this revelation were somewhat troubling for a galactic civilization that had spent millennia congratulating itself on achieving perfect safety and intellectual sophistication. The possibility that true strategic thinking might require exposure to actual danger was not a comfortable notion for species that had eliminated all sources of discomfort from their existence. Perhaps most disturbing was the growing realization that the galaxy's self-proclaimed advanced civilizations might not be as advanced as they'd assumed. The elimination of all challenges from life might have produced beings of exquisite refinement and theoretical knowledge, but it had also eliminated the circumstances that produced the sort of practical intelligence that could adapt to genuinely unexpected situations. The Academy's response to this educational crisis was predictably administrative. New safety protocols were established, curriculum adjustments were made, and everyone involved was required to attend sensitivity training sessions, designed to ensure that future cultural exchanges would be conducted with appropriate consideration for the mental health of all participants. Vexthari's recovery was eventually complete, though he developed what his physicians termed heightened awareness of environmental variables, which was a polite way of describing the sort of nervous vigilance that came from having one's fundamental assumptions about reality proven incorrect in a particularly direct manner. His academic performance remained excellent, though he showed a marked preference for theoretical studies over practical applications. The irony of the situation was not lost on those few observers who possessed the intellectual honesty to acknowledge it. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had created educational institutions designed to study the art of conflict, while ensuring that their students never experienced anything that might remotely resemble actual conflict. The result was a generation of theoretically brilliant strategic thinkers who possessed all the practical combat experience of particularly sheltered houseplants. Meanwhile, the primitive species from the Deathworld continued to demonstrate the sort of practical intelligence that could only be developed through exposure to genuine challenges. Their educational approach might lack the refined sophistication of advanced galactic civilization, but it produced beings who could adapt to unexpected situations and solve problems that theoretical knowledge couldn't address. The Academy's reputation for producing the galaxy's finest strategic minds remained intact, though the definition of finest underwent some quiet revision. Future exchanges with Deathworld species were conducted with considerably more caution, and the curriculum was adjusted to include more emphasis on the practical applications of theoretical knowledge, though always within the sort of safety parameters that ensured no student would experience anything more distressing than mild academic pressure. Zara completed her exchange program with distinction, earning praise from faculty who had learned to appreciate the value of practical perspective on theoretical subjects. Her final thesis, which examined the relationship between environmental pressure and strategic thinking development, became required reading for advanced students, though it was always presented with appropriate warnings about the potentially disturbing nature of its conclusions. The broader lesson, for those willing to acknowledge it, was that true advancement might require something more than the elimination of all sources of discomfort from existence. The galaxy's most refined civilizations had achieved remarkable sophistication in their theoretical understanding of complex subjects, but they had also eliminated the circumstances that produced the sort of practical intelligence that could apply that understanding effectively. The feeding tube in the end became a symbol of something considerably more significant than one student's medical requirements. It represented the ultimate conclusion of a civilization that had achieved perfect safety at the cost of practical competence, theoretical excellence at the expense of adaptive intelligence, and intellectual sophistication while abandoning the sort of environmental pressure that forged genuine strategic thinking. The Academy continued to pride itself on being the pinnacle of galactic civilization, though the definition of civilization had become somewhat more complex than anyone had initially assumed. The crystal spires still reached toward the artificial sky, the refined students still gathered to contemplate the universe's mysteries, and the educational process continued to produce theoretically brilliant graduates who possessed all the practical experience of particularly well-educated furniture. But occasionally, when the artificial lighting hit the crystal spires just right, observant viewers might notice that the gleaming testament to advanced civilization cast shadows that looked remarkably like the bars of a particularly comfortable prison, one designed to protect its inhabitants from anything that might challenge their fundamental assumptions about themselves and their place in the universe. The Deathworld girl, meanwhile, had returned to her primitive planet, where the strategic thinking was straightforward, the challenges were genuine, and nobody needed to eat through a tube unless they'd made the sort of mistake that natural selection was designed to address. It was, all things considered, a rather more honest approach to education, even if it lacked the sophisticated refinement that truly advanced civilizations demanded. The question of who exactly represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization remained diplomatically unresolved, though the answer had become considerably more complex than anyone had initially assumed. Sometimes, it seemed, the most advanced approach to any problem was the one that actually worked, regardless of how primitive it might appear to those who had never needed to test their theories against anything more challenging than academic peer review. The tube, as it turned out, was not just a medical device but a metaphor for the sort of intellectual nourishment that came pre-digested, carefully processed and delivered in controlled doses to minds that had lost the ability to handle anything more challenging than perfectly safe theoretical concepts. It was perhaps the ultimate symbol of what happened when civilization became so refined that it forgot how to chew.